And hello and welcome to today's webinar, Contactless Payments, Merchant Benefits, and Implementation Considerations, brought to you by the Secure Technology Alliance Payments Council. Hello, my name is Randy Vanderhoof, and I'm the Executive Director of the Secure Technology Alliance. And today's webinar is being recorded, and it will be available for playback, along with the presentation deck, after the webinar has been concluded. There will also be time at the end for questions, so I encourage listeners to submit their questions using the user dashboard on your screen. I'll return at the end of the presentation to lead the Q&A, and I encourage you to submit your questions while the speakers are presenting so that we have time to organize them in advance so we can get to as many of them as we have time for at the end. So if we can go to the first slide. So let me introduce today's presenters for the webinar. So Oliver Manahan is Director of Business Development for Infineon Technologies. And prior to his current role at Infineon, Oliver was the Vice President of Emerging Payments with MasterCard. And in his role, Mr. Manahan spent 10 years managing MasterCard's EMV chip, contactless, and transit programs for North America. Oliver is a board member and is also chair of the Payments Council. We also have Jose Correa, who is responsible for strategic partnerships and business development in the secure payments business line of NXP. And he's been actively involved in the Secure Technology Alliance and the U.S. Payments Forum for the past 12 years and has been instrumental in EMV migration projects both in the U.S. and Canada, as well as the transit fare collection projects in the U.S. Third, we have Alan Friedman as Vice President of Payment Solutions at Ingenico Corp, North America, where he is responsible for Ingenico's EMV implementation strategy in the United States. Alan is a board member of the Alliance and active participant in the Payments Council and the U.S. Payments Forum. And Roberto Cardenas is currently the Digital Payments Consultant at TSYS organization, supporting both TSYS's issuing and acquiring business across the global enterprise. Mr. Cardenas is a technical associate at Ingenico, and additionally, he is actively participating in both the U.S. Payments Forum, Mobile and Contactless Payments Working Committee, and the Testing and Certification Working Committee. So if we can move to the next slide. So for those of you who are not familiar with the Secure Technology Alliance, let me give a quick overview. So the mission of the Secure Technology Alliance is a nonprofit, multi-industry association working to stimulate the understanding, adoption, and widespread application of secure solutions. And we provide in a collaborative, member-driven environment education and information on how smart cards, embedded chip technology, and related hardware and software can be adopted across all markets in the United States. Now, this is a very broad mission, and on the right side of the screen, you see the principal markets that we focus these activity towards, and they include, among others, the access control markets, authentication, healthcare, identity management, the Internet of Things, mobile, transportation, and as the focus of this event, on payments. So across the industry, member-supported organizations, we do the following things to educate and stimulate the market by bringing together all industry stakeholders to effectively collaborate on promoting secure solutions technologies and addressing industry challenges. We do that by publishing white papers, hosting webinars and workshops, newsletters, position papers, and provide content available on our internet web resources. We also do conferences and events that focus on specific markets and technology. We offer education and training programs and industry certifications for the industry professionals that we support. We provide networking opportunities for professionals to share ideas and knowledge, and we produce strong industry communications through our public relations, web resources, and social media to shape the discussions around secure technologies, especially related to payments. If we can go to the next slide, please. So looking more deeply on one of those work streams, which is our Payments Council, they have a more specific focus within the Greater Alliance organization, which is the focus on securing payments and payments applications in the U.S. through industry dialogue, commentary on standards and specifications, technical guidance, and educational programs about the means of improving the security of payments infrastructure and enhancing the payments experience. On the right side there, you see a list of a few of the council resources that have been published specifically around topics related to contactless payments, including discussions on implementation issues with contactless payments, benefits of contactless for both issuers and merchants, which this webinar is an extension of that work product, security around contactless payments, and education around emerging markets like wearables and IoT payments and blockchain for payments. So please take advantage of those resources after you've completed this webinar. Next slide, please. So next we'll turn this over to Oliver Manahan, our Payments Council Chair, who will address the value of contactless payments and some of the drivers of this technology in today's market. And I believe he's going to start off with a polling question for our audience. Oliver?
Yeah, thanks, Randy. So the polling question should be coming up fairly shortly here. And it's really just so we can get a good understanding of the various attendees for today's webinar. So whether you're an issuer, merchant, acquirer, processor, payment network, or other. And I believe we leave this up for about 30 seconds or so just to allow everybody to provide their input. I believe each speaker, almost each speaker, has a poll question as well. So while this one is at a fairly high level, we'll be delving down into some deeper questions from the other participants who are presenting today. And just a little bit about me, you may have gathered from my accent already. I'm Canadian, so we're in a very heavily contactless market already, or fairly heavily adopted contactless market. So as I go through, I may sort of call out a couple of experiences, examples from the Canadian marketplace, but we're really looking to get into the U.S. market specifics, as it's a bit more nascent in the contactless space. So it's nice to see we've got almost a quarter of merchants, sort of 10% across other issuer, acquirer, processor, and payment, and then a fair almost half in the other category. So if we could move on to the next slide, that would be great. And this is still a poll question up. If we could get to the next one. There we go. Okay, thanks so much, Kathy. So wanted to go with a little bit of background first as to sort of what's changed since the mid-2000s when contactless was first rolled out in a couple of environments. So really in the 2005 timeframe, there were trials that were occurring. So it was, you could classify it as a handful of merchants, a handful of issuers, but really not enough critical mass or ubiquity to drive adoption or modify behavior for that matter. So as a consumer, you'd go with your contactless card and you could only use it in, 1 out of 1,000 merchants. And as a merchant, you would sit there and say, well, I hope that I might get more contactless transactions, but only a few issuers are putting out these cards. To add on to that, there were no clear benefits to the participants because at that time, pre-EMV, we're in a swipe environment. So the swipe took around the same time as a tap. And in that same couple of years, brands, major global and regional brands, came out with rules not requiring cardholder verification for some swipe transactions below a certain dollar amount, like $50. So that then reduced the benefit even more of contactless. To sort of add on to the complexity piece, the point of sale readers for contactless were add-ons. So it wasn't just you were getting the equipment that already had contactless capability, but in fact you had to get a separate reader, plug it in, do integration work to your standard point of sale system, and in some instances more counter space was then also taken up. And the contactless in that era, about 13 years ago, was based on magnetic stripe data, and not the EMV standard that we now have rolled out. Next slide, please. So fast forward to 2018 and what's changed, what's new? Well, as I just referenced, the contactless specifications are now based on the EMV standard. So it's globally interoperable. You can expect consumers to come from Europe, Asia, Canada, other markets, and have a card that when they tap works ubiquitously across all contactless interfaces. And of course, the same holds true as we're all consumers. If you get a contactless card, it will work in any contactless market in the world. And of course, it is a high standard of security then. The MSD contactless was secure, but EMV contactless is just another notch more secure than that. Contactless readers are now integrated into the point of sale. So whereas many merchants have undergone an EMV migration in the past few years, requiring new point of sale equipment, that point of sale equipment almost in all cases will have contactless capability already built into that. So really then the merchant enablement is a question of whether or not to do the enablement of that hardware that already exists. And what's a little bit different in the U.S. market is that contactless enablement from the merchant perspective is actually leading the issuance. And I've got a bit more detail in a subsequent slide on that. But it's worth noting that in other markets, it was typically the issuance of cards and devices that came before the merchant adoption. And so it was skewed a bit in one direction versus the other. And of course, new form factors such as wearables improve consumer affection. So once you enable for contactless for cards, you can also accept the mobile pays, watches that are enabled, etc. And I think just as a global trend, brands have been requiring contactless adoption in almost all other regions. So of course, the US being fairly recent to US didn't make so much sense to make that a hard requirement. But certainly in other markets, that tends to be what's going on now. So you'll see more consumer devices coming, whether cards, mobile phones, et cetera, from other markets, US, hoping and expecting and being familiar with contactless acceptance. Next slide, please. So the next three slides are sort of consumer benefits, merchant benefits, and issuer benefits. So from the consumer perspective, people prefer tap versus dip. It's an easier, more intuitive transaction. The transaction happens more quickly, so the throughput at the lane is faster. And there's also a bit of a cool factor to it. I know when I go down to the US and I've tried my contactless cards at any merchant I go to where it says I can tap, and in many instances, they're sort of surprised that, oh, I didn't know our device could even do that. That's pretty cool. When is it coming to the US? So, I'd like to tell them soon, but that's all a matter of market timing. And in other markets, what we've seen is that consumers will increase their usage and frequency of payments of an electronic format when they can tap. And consumers will seek out issuers of dual interface cards. And as sort of an aside, I was just recently at a local sort of farmer's market where they sell local goods and things like that. And I biked there. So I didn't bring any cash with me. I just had a couple of contactless cards and my Apple Watch. And so I thought, I won't be able to buy much stuff here. As it turned out, just about every one of the merchants had a Bluetooth-capable point of sale reader that connected to their mobile phone. And that Bluetooth reader accepted contactless, contact EMV, and a swipe. So I ended up spending a lot more money than I expected to, but I think that's one of those use cases where, we always hear about those seldom used merchants that tend to be cash. Once you get to a more contactless and electronic environment, consumers, whether not having cash or only having a limited amount of cash on hand, will actually spend more at merchants or buy things where they may not otherwise have had if the acceptance allows them to with the limited payment options that they brought. So from the other benefits to consumers, there's no forgotten card. I know I've done that a couple of times where you just sort of walk out, forget the card, or if you do walk out, then there's a loud beep. It sounds like you've stolen something and you have to go back and remove your card. Of course, if you're just tapping, there's nothing to forget. It's a consistent experience across devices. So whether you're tapping a card, a wearable, a mobile device, it's the same interaction all the time. And it's somewhat foolproof. So if you're tapping a card versus, perhaps tapping a phone, and for whatever reason there's a little glitch and the tap doesn't work, then you still have your card out. You can insert your card and do a contact-based EMV transaction. And if for whatever reason that doesn't happen to work, I'm not sure if that happens very frequently, but you've still got the magnetic stripe on the card. So allowing contactless sort of gives you one more interface to make sure an electronic transaction goes through. And of course, for the consumer as well, it opens up new use cases. So for those that live in major metropolitan areas, they can perhaps go on mass transit, if not now, then in the next couple of years, as the major transit authorities are looking closely at open loop payment, contactless acceptance. Next slide, please. So for the merchant side of things, EMV, as I said, we've just gone through in the past couple of years a fairly major migration. Unfortunately led to an increase in transaction time in many instances. So, there's quick chip and other things like that have helped, and people have optimized their code and whatever they can do to make the transaction faster, but it's still not as fast as a contactless transaction. So contactless is a reduced transaction time, hence faster throughput. And for those that are early adopters and tech savvy, they see it as a cool way to pay. So there's a bit of merchant affection there as well. As I noted earlier with EMV migration, most of the new point of sale devices have contactless capability built in. So it's no longer a decision of whether or not to buy a new piece of hardware, but whether or not to do the software work, go through the certification et cetera, that Roberto will be talking about later, to actually enable the contactless. And once you've enabled for contactless cards, then you're also able to accept, the contactless other devices such as wearables, the XPays, Apple, Samsung, Google, et cetera. Next slide, please. And from an issuer perspective, it's very much the corollary of the merchant side, whereas EMV improves security, but also increased transaction time. So contactless now has the same benefits of EMV security, but decreased transaction time. So other markets have shown that consumers use dual interface cards more frequently, particularly for lower value transactions. I mean, the case that I just cited, but whenever I go into a coffee shop, et cetera, I don't see people in Canada at least pulling out $5 or $10 notes anymore. They simply tap their card, tap their phone, scan a QR code, et cetera, to pay for that, $2 or $3 cup of coffee. So the tender shift tends to go from cash to electronic the more that contactless is enabled in a market. And whereas the vast majority of face-to-face transactions are still card-based, dual interface cards help shift consumer behavior to tap. So I think, those of us that live, eat, and breathe payments for a living get all excited by mobile pays and wearables and things like that. When I think about, my mother, brother, family members, et cetera, they don't think a lot about payments, but when they do, it's typically pulling out a credit card or a debit card. And if they get the opportunity to tap it, they get used to that. And as they get used to tapping a card, then that behaviorally shifts them to, oh, that's kind of cool. I didn't know I could do that with my phone, or I didn't know I could do that on my watch. And then they get more motivated to use other forms of contactless payment. Next slide, please. So very quickly, some statistics. So what I was talking about earlier about merchants actually leading adoption in the U.S. market, this is based on Visa and MasterCard data. 46% of transactions occur at contactless enabled merchants. So these merchants actually have contactless enabled. Of course, we're not seeing a lot of transactions because, the bottom part of the bullets here lead to that conclusion because only 5% of cards are contactless enabled today, so 7% credit, 1% debit. But as you move down the merchant categories there, 70% of merchant locations are capable of contactless transactions. So that speaks very heavily to the fact that the recent EMV adoption has had new point of sale devices rolled out that have the contactless capability. And now, if you look at all new shipments of point of sale devices, over 95% of them are contactless capable. So even though there's a relatively limited number of cards in market, there's been a 10% increase in active unique merchants in the U.S. Year-on-year basis. So some of that's due to, Apple and others out there pushing their contactless payment. And from an issuer perspective, while limited, we are definitely seeing growth in dual interface cards coming to market. And there's an 80% growth in contactless transactions year to year. So that's just an indication of, whereas perhaps a year ago it might have been 1 or 2% of cards, now it's 5% of cards. So we're seeing a fairly significant growth in the contactless transactions, and just under $23 average ticket size. So again, this speaks to the cash displacement argument and the fact that people tend to pull out cards or other contactless devices more frequently to pay for lower value transactions, whereas before they would have felt more comfortable perhaps pulling out a $20 bill and then having to have the cashier make change, et cetera, et cetera. I believe that's the end of my slides. Next slide, please, and I'll see if I've missed one. No, I haven't. Okay, good. So next up is Jose Correa from NXP, and he'll be going through the status of international implementations. Thank you.
Thanks, Oliver. So, as mentioned, I will cover a little bit of international implementations, and want to be clear, this will serve as a follow-up for those who joined Similar Merchant, I think, over a year ago, and highlight the changes on different countries that we mentioned last time. For those who joined us a few weeks ago, I'm sorry to say it's no big surprises on the next few slides. I do want to clarify that this section will cover status updates from outside the U.S. Now, we're hoping that shares some insights and some views on potential use cases that might apply to the U.S. and also can offer a view of what some cardholders are experiencing when traveling outside the U.S. But we do want to be clear that is focused mostly on implementations outside of the U.S. and the recommendations are specific to certain markets, right? The big thing is that we want to show that contactless is not only becoming mainstream, but in some cases the leading method of payment. So next slide. So first we'll look at the UK. So we had seen in the past how TfL was a key driver. So public transportation was a key driver for contactless acceptance. What we see now in the last couple of years is how that went to the next level, right? So issuance jumped significantly. So expectation that cardholder would have a contactless card is high. And not only that, the user is now familiar with different type of merchant categories. So as Oliver mentioned, there's a lot of cash displacement in place here with I guess a quite interesting example with Church of England actually accepting contactless donations now. So with mobile POS devices that take contactless payments. So that clearly shows areas where in other countries we wouldn't expect so easy and fast cash displacement taking place. Next slide, please. So then we look at Australia. Now for Australia, what's interesting is that the growth on contactless, it's not a significant growth on contactless share on compared to the all card payments. It's actually a significant growth on contactless on share among all payments, right? So it's now becoming the leading payment method in the country. So next slide, please. Then we're going to look at Canada, where while not as high as the share, and so while contactless is not as high as the share as in Australia, it's still showing significant growth. And what's interesting, and as we've seen in the past, is that growth has gone kind of hand in hand as limits are gone up, like no CVM limits have gone up in the country. Now, what's also interesting in Canada is how contactless is moving to new different categories, right? And we see public transportation also taking the lead here and opening contactless acceptance in those markets has been key. Next slide. So while we've been tracking those three countries, I think what has changed the most in the last few months is they're definitely not alone. So it's no longer some limited use cases. Now we see different countries jumping in and showing tremendous growth on contactless issuance and contactless acceptance, with different specific drivers depending on the country, right? So we have in cases like Singapore where it's mostly being driven by a countrywide effort for cash displacement, moving everything to contactless payments. Then we have cases like Czech Republic where they literally leapfrog everyone on the percentage of transactions in Europe, right? So most of their transactions are through a contactless interface, and part of that growth has come from public transportation. Then we have Poland, where contactless acceptance is pretty much a given, with over 90% of terminals already capable and enabled for contactless transactions. Then we have some other cases where the drivers have been a little bit different, right? So Spain, we do have increased year over year on contactless, but it's both as a result of the user experience on contactless, but also as a result of increased card adoption. And then we have in the Americas, Chile, likely leading the region, the South American region on contactless acceptance, and taking it a step further again with the use of public transportation. Next slide. Now, the driver for different countries is depends on the region, and it goes hand in hand with user experience. But we have to recognize that a big component of it has been the push from the payment brands, right? They are driving both issuance and acceptance requirements, either through recommendations, guidelines, or even mandates. Now, and this is critical. I want to reemphasize that mandate, guidelines, and recommendations can be just regional and might not apply to the U.S. At this point. So I would ask that if there's any question or specific for a payment network, payment brand, you can approach, if you have a contact at them, you can approach them and ask for clarification on recommendations and guidelines. If not, I'm sure the Secure Technology Alliance can connect you to the different payment networks if you need more information. So as we close this section, I think we're going to go to another poll. So next slide. I think that's for me. Yeah. So this poll is definitely geared to merchants. So I know I would anticipate then a significant answers being on not applicable, but it's basically just asking about your plans, right? So where are you today on contactless acceptance, and what are your immediate plans? Is it something that you see in the near future, or might take a bit longer, or might not be considered also? Okay, so that's actually really, really promising. I'm happy to see a significant percentage of the merchants, the vast majority, already accepting contactless payments or having already plans in place. I'm particularly happy to see a 0 next to no plans to accept contactless payments. So that's quite good at telling for the industry and the growth that's being seen globally. So with that, we'll move on to the next section, and I'll let Alan continue with the merchant benefits.
Thank you, Jose. So yeah, we're going to go over some potential merchant benefits. These may not benefit each and every merchant, but they all have some things in common. So a lot of people may find this interesting. Next slide, please. So merchants care about their consumers, their customers. Customers are going to perceive that checkout is faster. Time through lane will definitely be faster if you have multi-lane, or even if you just have a single lane. The time through there will be faster just because there's no juggling of the credit card. You don't have to try and find the slot to insert the chip, or because you're just going to be tapping the card. There is a possibility that loyalty programs can be tied in with mobile wallets. That's not a function of the payment application usually, but it can be tied in the mobile wallet application. Mobile applications such as Apple Pay and Google Pay utilize biometrics and tokens to increase security. The biometrics is either the facial or iris recognition or thumbprint, which identifies you as you. And tokens, of course, mean that merchants are not going to have the PCI concerns of having full card numbers on file. Contactless transactions are more intuitive. They require less help from a sales associate. Again, not having to point out where the slot is and not having to remind, not having to tell them to leave the card in and things like that. The transaction speeds, the transaction speed itself is typically the same. However, the contactless payment is the fastest way to pay because, again, there's no searching for the slot. If you're using a mobile wallet, then there's not even any searching for the card. It does eliminate issues with premature card removal, when the transaction essentially has to start over again. And it prevents issues with partial insertions of cards or bad reader connections. If there's dirt on the chip on the card, then that can cause a bad reader connection and require reinsertion or even falling back to a magnetic swipe. It doesn't happen often, but tapping, of course, you don't run into any of that. Next slide, please. Additional payment options. Now, there's a lot of press, a lot of marketing things about consumers want to choose how they pay, and merchants in general want to allow their customers to pay how they want to. Typically, they'll spend more if they can use what they want to use. Contactless, as Oliver mentioned earlier, includes cards, phones, watches, rings, and future NFC-enabled options that we don't even know about today. We wouldn't have imagined rings some time ago. Rings are coming. There are some available in the market. Absence of contactless transaction limits. Now, this is specific to the U.S. And potentially other countries, but some countries do have contactless limits where you have to insert the card if it reaches a certain amount. The U.S. has no limit specifically on contactless transaction values, so it doesn't matter. The same no CVM limits apply as for contact transactions. So if you insert your card and it asks for a PIN, then if you tap a plastic card and exceed that same limit, then it can ask you for a PIN. However, the mobile wallets can use their biometric functions on the phone to substitute for a PIN. So that's a very seamless type of transaction because your facial recognition or your thumbprint prevents even a prompt for a PIN. It's a pre-authorized, pre-validated transaction using that biometric. So you won't be asked for a PIN using that payment method, no matter what the amount is. Most mobile wallets use the biometrics, replacing the PIN tree, as I just said, and then as Oliver mentioned, if it's easier to pay, then people get used to that and they tend to spend more. Next slide, please. So the security on contactless cards and mobile wallets is the same security that's on a contact EMV chip card using cryptographic security, creating a unique value on every transaction. They make it more secure than even the legacy magnetic stripe contactless transactions, and magnetic stripe contactless transactions did add a layer of security with a unique number, but it was not a cryptograph specifically. If there is an issue, as again, I think Oliver touched on this, if there's an issue reading a contactless card, the card can be inserted, which still maintains that EMV chip security. The chances of both contact and contactless failing on a card are very slim. And the EMV tokenization that's used in the NFC-enabled mobile device wallets protect the cardholder's actual account number using a token that has been issued by the card issuer, and that has been encoded on the chip in your mobile phone. Contactless acceptance can reduce cash handling, which is both expensive and risky, primarily replacing small ticket cash purchases. But again, since the U.S. has no real limit, and using a mobile phone even removes the necessity for a PIN, it could replace cash purchases of any amount. Next slide, please. So there are some additional service opportunities that we're seeing more and more. I'm seeing more and more of our customers taking advantage of. Vending machines are increasingly accepting contactless payments. There's quite a few out there right now that accept magnetic stripe contactless, and those are rapidly being replaced by the EMV, more secure contactless. Quick service restaurants, movie theaters, and others are adding contactless both at the cashier and at kiosks, self-service kiosks, either inside the merchant's premises or remotely. So sometimes, it may be around the corner from the movie theater, so it's not inside the theater, but you can pick up your tickets, pay for them at a kiosk that's outside. In addition, there are times when a kiosk might be placed in another store, in another merchant store. A specialty type kiosk might be located inside a big box store or inside a mall, and those are rapidly being implemented. Increasing usage and demand, parking lots, in addition, are now migrating to contactless EMV. Some big box merchants that did not have contactless initially are in the process of adding contactless. Mass transit open payments, as discussed earlier, will generate more contactless card issuance. And as that increases, of course, then you'll see people becoming more used to tapping, which will lead to them using those contactless cards at other kinds of merchants. Consumers will become more accustomed to contactless, and also wearables. As people become used to wearables and their payment options, they're going to start using those increasingly, because wearables are actually even faster and easier to use than mobile wallets. Sometimes the wearable is a single card brand or a single card that is just there's nothing to configure within the wearable. And some wearables do have mobile wallets built into them, like the watch that Oliver mentioned. But you press a couple of buttons on the watch, and you put it close to the reader, and you're done. It's very fast. Next slide. And we're up to our polling question. And this will take about 20 seconds. We really should have some, music to go along with this, like the Jeopardy theme song or something like that. But unfortunately, it should only be a few seconds of dead air, unless I keep on just talking, so you're still connected. Please do remember to submit any questions you have. We can answer those towards the end, or you can submit them after I'm done. Here we go. And the results. Now, speed through checkout is the winner, followed by the better customer experience. So very good. And the coolness factor is not a big winner. Oh well. All right, folks, thank you very much. Coming up now is Roberto Cardenas from TSYS to talk about implementation considerations.
Thank you, Alan. There are three general topics I'd like to discuss specific to merchant contactless implementation and considerations. Next slide, please. They are testing and best practices, education, and general deployment and acceptance items. If you do not have yet the experience of testing and certifying an EMV application, the first step is embracing that testing is fundamental to the EMV product lifecycle. Hardware and kernels undergo testing prior to the product being made available by the various technology providers. These tests are part of level 1 and level 2 testing through EMVCo. Level 3 testing is necessary to test the transaction chain, and that chain includes the hardware kernels, how the terminal is configured, the terminal application itself, the gateway and or processing host that you process through, and the payment network. All of this leads to the point that testing is fundamental to the process. It limits potential interoperability issues and will save time and money during the deployment life of the product. While preparing to work with your acquirer or processor, it's important to note that the acquirer or processor will have unique requirements in addition to the payment network testing requirements. Additionally, gateways connecting to processors may also have unique requirements. As stated previously, the transaction chain is being tested. Therefore, it's important to understand all the unique requirements each link in the chain has. As the 21% of respondents stated in a previous polling question, I believe in Jose's section, and as the 17 will experience in the future once they get certified, testing and certifying contactless technology is similar to that of EMV Contact. So if you've already completed an EMV Contact certification, then doing so with EMV Contactless will be familiar to you. That being said, it is vital to identify and align your EMV resources. There may be resources within your organization or within your gateway or processing partners that can be of great assistance. Also, the Secure Technology Alliance and the U.S. Payments Forum have a wealth of resources available, including white papers that offer clarity on requirements, answer common questions, and share best practices. Additionally, many third-party entities provide test tools and consulting services. Compiling a library of important documentation and knowing who or connecting with trusted, knowledgeable resources can reduce your learning curve and development timelines. And the final consideration on this slide focuses on faster EMV solutions. Also known as Quick Chip or M-Chip Fast, faster EMV works well with contactless and is a great option for contactless deployments. Switching gears a bit onto the next slide, when you are preparing to or are actively working with your acquirer, go ahead and go to the next slide. Thank you. So when you are preparing to or are actively working with your acquirer, processor, or gateway, you will need to determine your test requirements that include terminal capabilities, configuration, the merchant environment that it will be deployed, each network's individual test plan, and any tests your gateway and or processor may require. Be sure to conduct all internal testing unique to your specific environment. Test tools can be a great investment and should be procured prior to testing. Minimize unnecessary retesting by isolating the payment application from other software changes. Use standardized solutions to reduce the number of solutions that need to be tested or deployed in the same terminal family. And modularize and isolate EMV functionality by using semi-integrated solutions. These are all common and understood, time-tested considerations and best practices. On to the next slide. So this slide here discusses a major discussion point in the industry today, which is the need for EMV versus MSD. And there are three items I would like to highlight that are represented in the charts. And so while the slide is available, or while this information is included in the white paper and will be available when the slides are on the website, the three major items I'd like you all to take away from this particular graph or chart is that when a device or a card are both enabled with MSD and EMV capability, and the terminal is also equipped with MSD and EMV, the default will be to EMV. MSD will not be utilized in that transaction. Additionally, if a card or device only has EMV and does not have MSD, and the terminal has MSD and EMV, it will go down the EMV path. And conversely, if the device only has MSD and the terminal capability is MSD and EMV, then it will default to MSD. You will see that there are two lines here that also show a mutual exclusivity, which simply stated means that, for example, when a card or device do not have MSD, they only have EMV, and the terminal capability is MSD and not EMV in that first example, then the transaction may be terminated and processed as a contact chip or a magnetic stripe transaction. And the same for the converse, which is the card or device only can do MSD, the terminal can only do EMV. The transaction again may be terminated and processed as a contact chip or magnetic stripe transaction. Well, the last 6 lines, however, need to be scrutinized a bit more. Many issuers today are deploying contactless without MSD, and additionally, Visa is retiring MSD, and it will be retired as of April 13, 2019. So those last 6 lines there that you see either with a dash or an XA in the MSD column under card or device capability, those scenarios in the future and to a certain extent today are actually occurring because there are only a limited number of MSD only devices, and in the future those numbers will become greater and closer to 0. And so therefore, if you as a merchant are desiring to implement contactless, the best thing to do is to implement EMV, and where applicable, you can also implement MSD, but EMV is really the way to go. Next slide, please. Some additional deployment and or acceptance considerations. Of course, the business case and the cost of deployment. As Oliver mentioned, the merchant's acceptance of EMV is outpacing that of card deployments. So at the moment, merchants are ahead of the game. As cards become more prevalent in the marketplace, those merchants will have an advantage versus those that have not deployed contactless because as all the conversations led up to this point, there are so many benefits that come along with a contactless transaction. And as Alan pointed out specifically, there's less friction associated with a contactless transaction, which just makes the experience above and beyond far better. So it goes above and beyond, I think, what the poll question suggested, which is the cachet of it may be on its way out. It's more of a need now to deploy. And so the business case is, I believe, becoming more, it's better understood. And when merchants are going in and looking at that next application or doing that first application that had contact to begin with, or will have contact to begin with, it's a natural addition to bring contactless online and making that part of the testing experience as well as the deployment of that terminal application. Additionally, there are some challenges that have been raised regarding mobile wallets, specifically wallet identification and tokenization. There are efforts today ongoing through the United States Payments Forum that are tackling these two items. And I recommend that if you are interested in the conversation or would like to contribute to the conversation, I encourage you to join those working committees. And that will allow you to have a voice at the table and influence the direction of those solutions for those particular challenges today. And then lastly, education. I think we all would agree that no matter how much we know or feel that we know about EMV, there's just always more to learn. And as new technology becomes available in the marketplace, new form factors, just whatever the case may be, there's a need to educate not only ourselves and the roles that we play within our organizations and our coworkers and customers, but also the need to educate the consumers. There are different form factors out in the marketplace, whether it's just a card or a mobile device, but there are watches and there are rings on the table to come out, and all these other new ways of having a form factor. They impact how the experience occurs at the point of sale. And so educating the consumer on how it's supposed to work, along with the cashiers, any type of training, all of the support staff at your point of sale, it's important that we all understand and embrace that contactless is here, it's coming, it may be already out there, and depending on your form factor, how does it work to really take advantage of the benefits that contactless is intended to implement. Additionally, having the appropriate signage in place to accommodate or to make awareness for the consumer at the point of sale that that device is enabled for contactless is also a critical piece of the conversation and a critical piece of the education factor. And again, there is a project ongoing or will be ongoing at the U.S. Payments Forum to tackle the contactless experience. And again, if you would like to be part of the conversation or influence the conversation, I encourage you to participate and make your voice heard. I believe we are now at our poll question. And the question is, what challenges do you see with accepting contactless payments? As stated previously, take about 20 seconds more or so to obtain answers. Very curious to see what all of you feel are the challenges with accepting contactless payments. I would be very surprised if we have none. I don't see any challenges. So we're very even across the board, very interesting. So testing and certification, of course, is a challenge. Getting the business case understood, lack of consumer demand, all fell nearly a third across the plate. And then consumer, and of course, there are some that do not see any challenges with accepting contactless payments. So very interesting poll question. And I believe I hand it back to Randy.
Yes, I've got it. Thank you, Roberto. And thank you also the other panelists for this great presentation. We're getting up close to the hour. I just wanted to give people a heads up that we'll try to stay on a little bit past the top of the hour to take as many questions as we can. So if you can stay with us, that would be wonderful. If we can go to the next slide, please. Before we get into the questions, I just wanted to point out to you that there's two really good websites where we have contactless payments information available. The Secure Technology Alliance Knowledge Center, which has resources listed here that are available, and the U.S. Payments Forum Working Committee site for the Mobile and Contactless Payments Working Committee, which published this new information about contactless that is beneficial for merchants. So please take advantage of those resources as well. And if we could advance to the final slide while we answer questions. So the first question I have, I'm going to pass this to Oliver, if you could. How many issuers are producing cards with contactless technology, and what are the chances that all of these issuers will be reissuing cards again right after their initial EMV issuance?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Randy. You know, I obviously have to stay with what's in the public domain. So I think in the U.S. market right now, it's probably less than 10 major issuers. And when I say major, some of those are large in the global sense, less large in the U.S. We do know that there are several, I would say, again, top 10 issuers that have spoken at conferences recently, in fact, the U.S. Payments Forum, stating that they're in the planning stages. So I think we'll be seeing a fair number and a fair bit of issuance over the next year or so. And the follow-on point is actually a great one insofar as a lot of the issuers started with contact EMV. We're trying to get there for the October 2015 liability shift, which means that in October 2018, a 3-year issuance cycle will have passed. And of course, some went out with 4-year reissuance cycles, et cetera. So as those expire, that becomes sort of the perfect inflection point to say, is this the right time to do dual interface? And of course, the market will dictate if they see some of their competitors moving to dual interface that it's the right time to go. So yeah, personally, I believe there will be a fair bit of activity in the next 12 to 18 months that we'll see from the issuing side.
Great, thanks, Oliver. Question for Jose. A question was raised about the difference between contactless security. I assume that meant EMV security versus the MSD or the precursor to EMV contactless. Could you address that?
Yeah, and I guess it might be more of a clarification just to make sure that it's well understood. I mean, we're not arguing whether contactless is more secure. Well, and Oliver, feel free to jump in because I believe that this might be also on your section. So it's not an argument on whether contactless is more secure than contact, right? It's just compared to the initial deployments where it was MSD. It was more a comparison against the initial deployment when it was MSD. So contactless EMV is being a more secure option than contactless MSD, and obviously a more secure option than MagStripe than a MagStripe swipe, right? So that's now if you ask me on my personal point of view, I do agree there are some intrinsic benefits of contactless on security that might not be specific to the technology, but to the behavior. So if you're paying contactless, it's likely that you're always going to keep your card at hand. You're not going to have to hand it off or pass it along to someone behind the counter. So there is a certain level of extra security, but it's not from the technology in those cases, right? It's more from the actual behavior and the overall experience. But Oliver, if you want to add something there.
Yeah, just quickly, I hope, or I'll try. So MSD we talked a lot about, which is mag stripe data. So the original contactless was based on that. It did actually generate a random number for each transaction. Now, it was a 3-digit random number, so in theory, that would give you sort of a 1 in 1,000 chance of guessing it. But based on the algorithms that were used, it was actually more like a 1 in 50 chance. So, more secure than purely static data. But as you get to EMV contactless, you get the full, 8-byte cryptogram. So you get the same level of security with EMV contactless as you do with EMV contact. Totally agree with what Jose said about not surrendering your card to a merchant, particularly in those locations where they disappear with it. And then, of course, as you get into mobile payments, and as Alan stated, you actually tokenize, which instead of using the same 16-digit number that you'd see on the front of the card, it actually uses a representation of that 16 digits within the mobile phone, so that if there's any sniffing to occur on the line, et cetera, it's getting just a token of the primary account number, not the primary account number itself. And then, of course, there's biometrics from a security perspective that get layered on with the mobile payments as well. So hopefully that helps clarify a bit.
Okay, great, thanks. And for Roberto, if a merchant already supports contact EMV and quick chip, will regressing testing suffice to enable contactless EMV?
So yes, so if a device does quick chip today or faster EMV and contact, then just work with the acquirer processor to test the contact functionality. Depending on some of the rules, there may be a need to retest everything, or some may allow a regression test for those contact items. So it's something that you would need to work with directly with your acquirer to determine what they allow or don't allow. But yes, if something is already enabled today for contact and contactless, the device itself needs to be contactless capable. So of course, can't deploy contactless on a device that's not capable to begin with. So as long as the device itself is contactless capable, has the appropriate kernels for each payment network, then adding contactless to that solution is absolutely possible.
Okay, great. Thank you. I think we have time for one more question here. A bunch came in late, but I'm afraid we're already over time, so we'll have to cut these off. So I'll open this up to the group. Success of contactless in Europe was based primarily on its ability to handle offline transactions at the terminal. And so since the US doesn't support offline, is there really a value in the speed of the transactions for merchants to adopt contactless? Who would like to take that?
It's Oliver. I can take a stab. I'm sorry, I can take a stab because I was going to relate it directly to Canada.
Let's keep it short, just a quick soundbite. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, I think offline started in Europe. I think most of the contactless transactions are now online as well. And I think more directly relatable in Canada, our transactions are online. So it's the tap itself. It takes less than a half a second. If it then takes a couple of seconds for the authorization to go up and come back, the consumer is frankly, getting their burger, coffee, groceries, whatever. And so the perception, they don't notice that couple of extra seconds. The payment to them took the half second.
Anybody else?
I was going to mention exactly the same thing. That it's a lot about the perception and than the actual speed of transaction, and also highlight that while offline had a big role to play on EMV migrations, I think on contactless adoption, especially in the last 2 years, it has been driven by the overall user experience, at least in the countries that jumped in a bit later in the timeline for Europe.
Great, thank you all. Due to the lateness of the hour, I think we'll need to stop there, but those email addresses are up there. So if any of you have a specific question that you need answered that we didn't get to today, feel free to send that contact to me or to any of the panelists here. I want to thank all of you for your participation today, and also want to thank our speakers for their excellent content. Reminder that today's webinar is recorded and will be available for playback along with the presentation deck after the webinar is concluded. And you will receive an email with a link to where you can listen to the recording and download the presentation. Also, please feel free to share this information within your organization to others who could not participate in today's webinar. This concludes today's webinar, and I want to thank you all and have a great day.